Hi, Jill. Thanks so much for joining us here on the podcast today. I'm so happy to have you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your community.
Of course. Well, there are so many facets to your story, and I thought maybe we could start with just kind of an overview backstory of what led you to doing the work that you're doing today, and then we can kind of get into the details.
Absolutely. So as you know, my story is kind of a long and winding road, and the true backstory might take several podcast episodes. So being that we're talking about how I got to where I am right now, let's just go back to the part where I am a midlifer and I'm feeling that call to the pivot, that need for something more, that need for something different. And that basically all started with what I'm going to call a spiritual awakening that happened approximately 3 years ago. And that was a twofold process. I was stepping into myself as an author and writer at that time, but I was simultaneously embarking on a sobriety journey. And so those two things together began that awakening. And that awakening was just a whole bunch of things that journeyed me back to rediscovering my truest self. And so that's pretty much how my story starts evolving from 3 years ago to where I am exactly right now today.
Wow. Okay. So why don't we talk a little bit about if we can kind of go to your career first. You started a career in education. I know you're still in education, but I think we both had a pivot around the same time. And I'll call it a pivot, like right after the 20-year mark, right? I still have my hand in education as well, but I stopped my full-time teaching at around 21 years. But I still do some part-time teaching. So can you talk about your career in education and maybe the skills that you feel allowed you to do some coaching work that you are now doing today?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm in education and I'm actually an elementary teacher. So I've been teaching the young kids in the classroom for over 20 years. And this is actually my 23rd year that I'm stepping into now. And even though I teach young children, I feel, like you said, that you're just kind of a natural teacher when you're a teacher. Let's face it, you're born to facilitate, you're born to lead. You love evolving, you love seeing the children and the students evolve. And so I find that when I'm working with adults or preparing to work with adults, it truly is not that much different than when I'm working with children. They are still people. They need to be nurtured. They need to be led. They need to follow. And I think for me, the biggest thrill is whether you're working with young people or you're working with people your own age, we all just have this innate need to evolve. And I love the feeling of evolving myself. I always have my hands in personal development of some sort. I'm very eager to learn new things. And so I get very excited. And I think that energy is infectious. So while this awakening for me was happening, I kept hearing in the background a voice saying to me, teach what you yourself need to learn. Teach what you yourself need to learn. And so I haven't left the classroom yet, but I guess I'm setting myself up for Act 2. What is it going to look like now as I'm getting ready to leave public school education and the younger students? I can absolutely see myself coaching and mentoring adults who are in the same or similar spot that I am in life, who are just looking for more.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think it is really contagious when you have that natural energy, and you describe teachers perfectly, but I would just add this caveat that good teachers are those teachers that bring that energy, right? And
Yes,
want to follow
good caveat.
their students. And I fully agree with that. I worked with students from kindergarten all the way to university. The last 11 years were university level. And it was easily transferable, the skills from really any level, just working with people and in general, if you know how to reach them. So I think it's also kind of nice to have your hand in what you want to try to do now rather than just waiting. Why wait? Why not test it out, right?
I agree
and
completely.
see. So there are different areas of your life that you have gone through some struggles, and I thought maybe we could touch upon each of those areas and maybe start with the earliest years and talk about your childhood a little bit first, if you wouldn't mind maybe sharing a little bit of that story.
Not at all. So I had a very, very traumatic childhood from my earliest years. I was raised in a house with some severe domestic violence, and I was exposed to things no child should ever have to see. And so I spent those earliest years, developing my core wound, as I'll call it, which was abandonment and rejection. And while that sounds like a terrible tragedy, I was simultaneously learning how to take care of and love myself. And this self-loyalty journey that I was basically forced to stumble upon actually became my lifelong journey into self-loyalty, into discovering myself, into the ability to take care of myself independently and to love myself most and to put myself first. So while that time in my life was very traumatic, I now know in retrospect that it was setting me up for all of these things that were coming my way because, as you know, in looking at my story, there was still lots more to come after that. But I would say that that traumatic childhood was the start of a lot of different mountains I was going to have to kind of get across throughout my life.
Yeah, and it's an interesting way of putting it. And that was kind of how I wanted to transition it, was that it's nice that you can see it that way, because I'm sure many people don't, that looking at such, tragic years as a child, that children shouldn't have to go through these things, right? And then if you do, you should have only roses after that. But when you have been able to overcome those things, you can overcome so much more. And you do, but then you're able to teach others, right? And you can't really teach others from a place of authenticity unless you've really gone through some very, very true struggles on your own. So another struggle that you have gone through is cancer. Can you talk a little bit about your cancer journey to us?
Sure. And I just want to backpedal for just
Sure,
a second
sure.
with the traumatic childhood. I did forget to mention something very big there, and that is that I had a wonderful teacher when I was going through that trauma who actually inspired me to become a teacher today. And a lot of times people will comment to me in the education world about the relationships that I do have with children. And I think it's because I'm able to come from that angle of compassion and understanding that they're all coming to school with their little baggage of luggage and we just don't know what's going on behind closed doors. So I want to just say that I do have a wonderful teacher out there that inspired that to come about during my childhood.
You know what, and that's true though, because sorry to interrupt, but I remember when I first started teaching in my very first year, my father was in education. He was a superintendent. He was an English teacher first and then a principal, and then he was a superintendent of schools and went on and on. But so I always looked to him obviously as a mentor when I was teaching, because I knew that he was, good at his job. And he said to me, the kids that are difficult, when I had complained, when I had first started, oh my gosh, I didn't know I was going to have these kids, these problem kids. And he said, listen, those are the kids that you need to love the most and you need to give the attention to the most. And it was just that one time, that's all it took. And from then on, I was able to work in inner city schools and love what I was doing and truly connect. Okay.
Yeah, the connection is great. So this leads me forward into early adulthood when I am diagnosed with a very rare cancer. Now, all of these things that, excuse me, had led up to this point are developing my resiliency. Let's face it, I have resiliency coming out of the roof at this point. So when I received my cancer diagnosis, like anybody else, when I first heard it, my world crumbled. I was planning my funeral. Who's going to take care of this? It was doomsday, as it should be. But I was able to quickly pick myself back up out of that because I just had to remind myself of all the things I had overcome up to this point to keep my head above water, to put myself first, to love and nurture myself and give myself, the care that I needed. And this was going to be no different. I just had to remind myself that everything was going to be okay. I was going to see the other side of this. And I don't want to use the word toxic positivity here because I know that's a big thing, oh, I can do this, I'm going to get through it. Of course, I had those moments where I was very weak and I wanted somebody to step in and save me. But for the most part of that journey, I definitely had my head held high and just had this inner faith and knowing that this was just going to be another one of those hurdles that I was going to make it to the other side of. Now, that's not to say that I didn't have a tremendous support group. I have a wonderful mother-in-law who stayed with me. I had friends who were caring for me, and having those pieces in place certainly helped aid me get through those things. I didn't do it solo, on a solo basis, and I don't want to sound that I did. However, I just had those strong roots and foundation pieces of that inner faith, that inner knowing, that self-loyalty, that if I had faith and believed, I would make it to the other side of this as well.
Wow. So it's definitely inspirational, and you're doing well today with your cancer journey. Everything's good.
Everything is wonderful. I'm 8 years out now. Thank you.
Wow, good. So this leads us into something that I've been waiting to talk to you about, because it's something that I can relate to and so many women can relate to, and that is weight struggles. So weight, relationships with food in general. So I don't know what your take on this is, but I'm waiting to hear what it is. I have struggled with weight my entire life, I think, since I was like in utero, and I want to hear what your experience is with this.
Okay. Well, I can certainly relate to that comment. I feel that, ever since I was a very young child, I was always the plump or overweight child amongst my cousins, amongst my friend groups. So I've struggled with weight my entire life. And my weight journey has been up and down, like most people. I've tried every diet under the sun, and I even ended up resorting to weight loss surgery, not once, but twice. So back in 2007, which seems so long ago, when lap band first became popular here, I embarked on a lap band journey. I underwent surgery, had the lap band inserted, and actually I was very successful. I lost 100 pounds. Believe it or not, at my short little build of 5'2", I was like 235 pounds. It was even higher than when I was full-term pregnant with either of my girls. A lot of that had to do with the fact that my life was just very stressful at that time. I was a caretaker for a dying grandma. I had 2 children at home. I was getting my master's degree. I was working full-time as a teacher. My life was very much a blur at that time when I was at my heaviest weight. But I had that surgery, and as I said, it was successful, lost 100 pounds, felt fabulous, thought, oh, I'm never going back. But then my lap band apparatus broke, and I had an emergency surgery to remove it. Once that got removed, I did actually successfully keep the weight off for about a year.
Wow.
And then I was diagnosed with cancer. Well, my cancer happened to be on my head, and it wasn't skin cancer. It was in the tissue. It was a soft tissue cancer that was on top of my skull, but under my skin. And I had, very rare.
I've never heard of that. Yeah,
called Adenoid Cystic Carcinoma. And it's actually normally found in the eye cavity or in the ear and neck and mouth region. But for some reason, I was a rare case, and it was found on top of my head. And I had extensive surgeries to remove the top of my head. I had a skin graft there. I went through major reconstruction to get all of this natural hair back on my head. Needless to say, I was laid up. I was having repeated reconstructive surgeries. And so I was laying around eating, of course, eating my emotions away. And so I put all of the weight back on. Well, I was blessed that my insurance company knew that the lap band failure was not my fault, and that it was a apparatus failure. So a couple of years into my cancer journey, I converted and had gastric sleeve and was able to take that weight back off again. And I'm very, very happy to say that I've successfully kept almost all of that weight off now for years and years and years. However, the key to that is that in that journey, I had to do a lot of self-discovery. And obviously I knew that I was an emotional eater, but I didn't know really what that meant. I would just say, oh, I eat when I'm happy, I eat when I'm sad. And I was a binger. I was the type of person who, if I opened a sleeve of cookies, I was not eating one, I was eating the entire sleeve of cookies, just no control. And it took a lot of work to realize a couple of things. First of all, I have a very big mother wound, which we'll talk about when we get to my book. But I realized that my mother, who did not know how to show love in a normal sense of the term, did show love through food. And so when she presented us with food, that's what I antiquated with love. And I wanted her to always be giving me food because that's the one way we connected. And so I became I started to connect food with love and antiquate food with love. And the other thing is, I grew up in the era of the clean plate club. So we grew up in a home where you did not leave that table until that plate was clean. So of course, when I was raising my daughters and they weren't finishing their plates and I was putting everything in my mouth because we can't waste the food. So I guess it was that self-discovery of realizing, oh, okay. And then I had to start training myself to look at a plate of food with scraps and say, nope, going in the garbage. So it took a lot of work to get there.
Wow. Well, congratulations on keeping it off and doing that work, because that is the key really to keeping it off. And I know a lot of people who have had the surgeries, and only a few have been able to successfully keep it off, like one or two probably.
I agree.
Yeah.
I have several friends who have as well. And I really feel like even when you have the surgery, that mental piece, that mindset piece is always missing from the doctor's office. Like they don't talk to you about how all of your issues are still there, even though you have had a physical change.
It's almost no different than giving you a pill that suppresses your appetite for a while. It's just, a temporary fix, right? So let's talk about the last piece of the puzzle here before we get to your book. You mentioned that you are newly sober. So what made you embark upon that journey?
Oh, wow. So let me try to back up to the beginning of this. So as I mentioned, my sobriety journey started 3 years ago, but let me put a little bit of a backstory on that. In that, I'll never forget when I went to my regular general physician to say that I wanted to have weight loss surgery way back in the day. And I think the very first words out of her mouth to me were, well, if you go do this and you lose weight, you're just going to get addicted to something else. What's it going to be? And I kind of was like, really taken aback by that. But guess what? She was exactly right. Because when I couldn't eat food anymore, I quickly turned to something that I could easily indulge in, and that was alcohol.
Yep.
Now, I come from a family of a long line of alcoholics on my mother's side and on my father's side. Again, something I address in the book. My mother actually drank herself to death with liver disease in her 60s. Her sister died the same exact death. And so alcoholism wasn't something I should be taking lightly. And I did thankfully realize that my drinking was getting out of hand. But I have to tell you that initially I didn't see it as a problem because there was a difference between me and those in my family. And that was that I was a good time drinker. I had fun. I was the life of the party. And so I didn't see it as a problem because when I was thinking of my family members who had issues with it, they were irate or they were violent or they were sad and depressed. And so it didn't give me that kind of problem. But as I said, I couldn't eat food anymore. So the drinking started off with, a glass of wine here and there to, oh no, now I'm drinking the whole bottle. And it was just getting way too out of control. And my daughters were, turning into young adults. And we would have these backyard parties with friends and family. And then they'd be showing me video clips of me at the karaoke machine or something. And it just got to be out of hand. And I decided, you know what? Number one, I do not want to follow the trajectory of my mother and father. And number two, I need to be a better role model for these girls. I need to show them you can still be the life of the party and have a great time without alcohol. So I embarked on a 90-day sobriety journey. I bought into this program after reading a book called A Happier Hour by Rebecca Weller. And basically the main character was me. She was, just the life of the party and living this life until one day she really looked in the mirror and was analyzing all of these hangovers and what she was doing. And I basically said the same thing. So at the end of her book, she offered a very inexpensive 90-day sobriety program, which consisted of emails and online coaching of sorts. And I had never at this point done any sort of online coaching or programming. It was my very first. And I dare say that $200 in that 90 days has been the most pivotal change in my entire life, because getting clarity, and stopping the pushing down and numbing of my feelings helped me to deal with a whole lot of skeletons and demons that needed to be addressed. So sobriety is what truly prompted my spiritual awakening and return back to myself. It was through writing my book and through, as I said, being sober and not numb, that I was able to actually get back to who I truly was deep down inside.
And I'm sure it feels like everything has come full circle and it's just falling into place now.
It's amazing. It's amazing. I wouldn't change it for anything. And I know that it doesn't happen for everybody that way. And I know that it doesn't happen for everybody at the same time. But I'm truly, truly glad that it finally did happen for me. And, you know, it's a whole different world when you're living with your true self and your true feelings, and you're expressing them and you're allowing them and you're dealing with them and you're getting to the bottom of them, instead of just living that life on autopilot and suppressing everything.
Yeah. So let's talk about the book then. You wrote a book. You can see all the books behind me. I taught literature for years and I love writing. I'm going to be writing a book of women's stories. So this podcast is kind of a part of that. And I'll talk to you about that later on.
Awesome.
But let's talk about your book right now.
So I have to confess that my whole entire life, because I had lived through some seriously crazy stuff, I knew, oh my God, I got to write about this someday. I got to write about this someday. But I never really thought about, I'm going to sit down and write a book, until just before 2020. It was actually before the pandemic hit that I said, okay, enough is enough. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to start an outline. And I started basically making a timeline of all the different events that happened in my life and deciding which ones I was going to include. And initially, the book was not really going to be for anybody else. I knew I would publish it, but I really didn't think about the amount of people that it could affect. I thought, I'm going to write the story. Maybe some of my family members and close friends will read it, and it'll kind of just be a way to extract everything that I had been carrying around with me for 4 decades and kind of take it out and put it into a monument of sorts, so I could kind of be done with carrying the load, if you will. But as I was writing that story, I obviously began a massive healing journey, forgiving journey, looking at bits and pieces of my life that I hadn't looked at in a very, very long time. And I began to understand some things about myself and about the people around me. As I said, I was becoming more spiritual as this was happening. And so I was reading books and falling into thought leaders, that I had never heard of or, partaken in before. And I began to understand things like, journeys, that we're all on a different journey. And I began to take all of these things that had happened with my mother a lot less personal, when I realized it was her demons and her karma that she was dealing with, and that it was never about me personally. And so it was like this whole new, beautiful, fresh set of goggles to look at everything. And then that's when I had the epiphany of, wait a minute, this book is not just for me. This book is for other people to heal as well. And I actually at that time went back, reread the chapters I had already written, and ended each chapter with something I refer to as the gift, so that I could show kind of the silver lining that came out of each one of those adverse situations, so that the reader could potentially connect with, I get this, I understand this, this happened to me as well. And so the book, while it is a memoir, it does have a bit of a self-help spin to it. And I think that it can help heal and transform others who also need to take a look at their lives and maybe put on a fresh set of goggles as to the things that have happened to them. And most importantly, to show that it doesn't matter what we go through. It's a choice, how we look at it, how we handle it. In my life, I had siblings. My siblings were very, very different than I was. They were not able to pull themselves out of that mess to the caliber that I was. And so, it really is about getting your head right, getting your mindset in the right place, no matter what you're going through, because you can get to the other side. You just have to be willing and able to see it for yourself.
Amazing. Well, I already checked your book out, so I'll be reading it for sure.
Oh, thank you. I forgot to mention that it is written under my pen name. So the title of the book is When the Apple Falls Far from the Tree, and it's discovering the gifts within the chaos. And it's written under my pen name, Margot Riley, which was obviously done because many of the people mentioned in my story are still alive. It was not for anonymity, just out of respect, to change, the names and places a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So as we bring this to a close, I wanted to just ask you one thing I ask everybody along this journey of yours, and it has been full of adventures, we'll call them, right? What has been you've had your share of challenges, but what has been your greatest joy, would you say, in the journey?
I think my ability to see my resiliency and my triumph through it all. I think about the fact that I put myself through college when I was living through such terrible times. I think of how I was able to get through that cancer journey. I think of how after, 3 decades of drinking, I was able to say, it stops here. In all of these life events, the domestic violence, the child abuse, the drinking, I was able to come to terms with the fact that I held the power to say, it stops here. And so I'm very proud of that. And I think that we all have that ability. And I wish that for everybody who is in these situations of generational trauma, that they understand that it can and does only take one person to make the change, that the power lies within us.
Great. Well, Jill, it has been a pleasure talking to you today. The last thing I wanted to ask was, where can we find you online for those who want to connect?
Beautiful. So I have a website. It's justbeingjill.com. Easy enough. And if you go to my website, there are some blogs there. There's a page dedicated on the tab to my book. You can check it out. You can even subscribe to my list to get chapter 1 and read that to see if it's for you. My book is available on Amazon.com and also MargotReilly.com, which is MargotReilly. And if you want to go to Instagram, I'm at Just Being Jill on there as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here with us today. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you. And I enjoyed the conversation.